Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. I hope everybody who's watching is staying warm and safe. And um, we pick up now on Kuf Tetzvav 115, and we pick up at the bottom of Kuf Yudalid Amud Bet. And we have just dealt with the Mishnah about a woman who reports that her husband died, that she is believed in a case where there is not a known fight between her and her husband going on, that their marriage is doing okay, and that there's peace in the world. We will get to the issue about the state of their marriage. The issue about the concern about there being peace in the world is what the Gemara says, that if their world is in a state of war, she might report that her husband is dead based on her interpretation of the facts or her perceptions, but the dummy, and not based on actual concrete clear knowledge. She'll see her husband shot and she'll assume he died, and he won't necessarily have died. So the Gemara now picks up with the following. It is 6 lines from the bottom, middle of the line. Amarava on Kuf Yudalid Amud Bet. Okay, so Amarava says Rava, Ra'avon Gria Mimilchama. If that's a case of starvation, that they're in the middle of a famine, not starvation, famine. That's and she reported to say my husband died in a famine. So you might think, well, definitely yes, because they're, of course, it's not like people are shooting guns and arrows, and she'll lose. She'll make assumptions in the fog of war. Maybe she'll know for definitely that he died. No, it's worse. Why? The ilu milchama ki amar meis bali b'milchama hu de lo mehemna hameis amitasu mehemna. In a case of war, she's only, Rava introduces an idea that is not at all clear in the Mishnah, that in a case of war, she's only not believed if she says, my husband died in the war. But if she says it was a time of war and she says he died on his bed, he had a natural death, she'd be believed. Why not? Who cares that there's war waging in the world? The ilu gabe re'avon, but when it comes to a case of famine, ad amra meis v'kvartiv, until she says he died and I buried him, because people will die on their bed in famine, they'll die of starvation, and she won't necessarily be believed. Why not? Because she'll think apparently that he has died, and maybe people will faint and look like they've died at such a time when they haven't actually died. So it's not so clear what the type of confusion is that happens at a time of Ravon, a time of famine. But Rava says that there can still be confusion, and in a way it's worse, because even something that looks like a natural death, she will not be believed in. Mapolet, now if we are dealing with a case of, let's say, being trapped under a fallen building, um, um, Harehu Kimil Chama, then it is like, that's also like a war, that she'll assume he died because the building collapsed, and won't necessarily be the case. The Amra B'didami, that she'll say based on something, on perception and on what it looks like, even if it's not definitely, even if it hasn't definitely occurred. Shiluach nechashim vakravim. How about if it's a time of snakes and scorpions? Okay, so that the wild animals in the place, and maybe he even was bit by one. So will she be believed? So harehu kain kimilchama damri b'didami. Same thing. So she's not believed. She'll say based on perception, on how she interprets what has happened, even if it has not definitely occurred. Dever, if it's a case of pestilence, Amilah Harehu Kimuchama. Some say also like a case of war, that you'll think he has died and he hasn't. The Amilay Enu Kimuchama, and some say it's not like war. Amilah Harehu Kimuchama. Some say it's like war. The Amra B'didami. She'll say based on things that look like it, even though it's not exactly it in her perception. The Amilay Enu Kimuchama. Some say it's not like war. Why? The Samchia that even if like he has been afflicted by pestilence, or he's in a place where there is pestilence, she's not going to make any assumptions. Why? Because there's a common saying. And what's the common saying? Shev Shani and Havi Mosna. Pestilence can go for 7 years. The Inish below Shani lo Azil, and a person won't die before his time. So there's a general understanding that just because there is a plague of pestilence, it doesn't necessarily mean that people will die, that people can be very much in the middle of such a plague and survive even in unlikely odds. And therefore, because in that case, she will believe in unlikely odds, she won't make any assumptions. But in these other cases, there's no such thing. So she won't believe in unlikely odds, and the woman will draw some conclusions which have not necessarily been the case. Okay. So basically, it's not specifically milchama, any type of a case where we can assume that people are drawing possibly incorrect conclusions. Now they raised the question, last line of Kuf Yudalid Amud Bet. Hechazika hi milchama be'olam mahu. Let's say we don't know that there's war. She went to some foreign country and she comes back and she says war broke out there. My husband died in the war. Is she believed? Because this is a class case of migo, because she didn't have to say that there was a war. So is she believed or not? Miyamrina and malo l'shaker. Should we say, look, there's no need to not the lie. If she was just making this up, she could have said that there wasn't war. Top of Kuftat Vav Aleph. The Ibaya Amar Shalom Olam, because she could say that there was peace in the world. Odilma, or do we say, Kivan the Ichzaka, since we now have established that there is war, Amar B'Dadami, it doesn't matter that we believe her sincerity and that she's telling the truth. We still say that she might be making false conclusions, even though she believes them to be true. So this is the basic point, that migo only helps ascertain that you're not intentionally lying. If you wanted to lie, you would say something else. Here we don't think for money you're intentionally lying. So the fact that you could have said something else doesn't matter. Yes, we totally believe that you're being sincere. But the point is that even with all of your sincerity and desire to tell the truth, maybe you're making some incorrect assumptions. So therefore, that's the question about will a migo help her situation at all? Now, Tosfos points out that in a way she always has a migo. Her standard migo is she could have said even at the time of war that he died on his bed. He didn't die in the war. And nevertheless, we don't believe him. So we don't believe her so even though she has a migo, so you see that the migo does no good. All the migo tells us is that she's not intentionally lying. So it does raise the question why the Gemara thinks that this case would be any better than a standard migo that she could have said he died on his bed. So Tosfos deals with that, but again, it proves the point that the migo is not really what's going to make a difference here. So let's take a look what the Gemara says. Rashi, I believe, also raises the question. 1 minute. Yes, so Rashi also raises the question. Rashi says a different verbiage for another question. 1 minute. Rashi says like this. Oh, no. Rashi has a different question, which is that if she's saying that he didn't, that she could have said that there was no, she's obviously not saying, well, forget it. Let's move on. Okay, so anyway, so let's take a look. Tashma, come in here. So even the achzak amr b'dadami v'lo asa mali l'shaker maraches kasei. So do we say that that even that on the one hand she didn't have to lie, on the other hand, even if she didn't have to lie, now that we know, and we don't think she's lying, now that we know there's war, she will make false conclusions. And the fact that she had no need to tell to lie won't make a difference. Nevertheless, she's still, and we don't think she's intentionally lying. We still think that she's just reporting based on perception and not based on the very concrete knowledge of the facts. So what do we say? Tashma, come in here. Okay. Ashinu aleinu bayis, ishnu aleinu me'ara. Let's say she comes and tells us that the house filled with smoke or the cave filled with smoke. Who made Vani Nisalti? And he died in the middle of the smoke, and I was saved. Okay, so that's similar to the war. Maybe she'll draw false conclusions. She escaped the burning house with smoke. She'll assume he died, but maybe, for all she knows, she actually escaped. So the Breita says, ain't an eminence. She's not believed. Now that's what the Gemara says is a classic case of we are totally only know that the house was filled with smoke based on her own testimony. Okay, so again, the fact that we know the circumstances based on her testimony doesn't make a difference. We still assume that she's making drawing incorrect conclusions. So the Gemara says, Shani Hassam, no, there it's different, even though she didn't have to tell us that the house had filled with smoke. The Amrullah, she'll say, we say to her, so look, you escaped that burning house filled with smoke. So something, a miracle happened to you. So maybe a miracle happened to him. So we already have, like, in you yourself, we have a concrete evidence that something that somebody could have escaped from that situation, and maybe that is what continues to undermine her testimony, or let us not base ourselves on draw conclusions from her testimony that he had actually died. But maybe under normal circumstances, if she's the one giving us all the information, maybe we would assume the conclusions that she is drawing. Okay, so that's the Gemara's question. So let's take a look. Tashma, let's try it again. Naflu aleinu avdei kochavim. Some non-Jews attacked us. Naflu aleinu listim, or some bandits attacked us. Who mace vinitzalti? Who mace vinitzalti? He died, and I was saved. Again, so something that the two of us, it occurred to the two of us. He died, I got out. So Ne'emenes, she's believed. And again, it's a similar situation where we wouldn't have known those circumstances were it not for her. And nevertheless, I'm sorry, excuse me, the opposite. So there we actually do believe her. So what makes that case unique and different that we do believe her? Why don't we say in that case also she'll say with incorrect perception? So the Gemara says no. Hassam ki Rav Idi. There, the reason she's believed is like Rav Idi. Dam Rav Idi, Isha klei zaina aleha. A woman, her weapons are on her. What does this mean? So Rashi says that there, because that there's two things going on there, which makes it different than all the other cases. The first thing is that it happened uniquely to them. It's not in the middle of a big war or a big pestilence. It happened uniquely to them. And since it happened to the two of them, it's more likely that the situation is less chaotic and that she actually is able to report accurately about what happened. Now, what about the fact that she escaped? Why don't we say that if she escaped, then presumably he escaped as well. Like we said before, that even when there's a good reason to think that those were the facts, if she managed to escape, maybe that should make us assume that he's escaped as well. And for this, the Gemara answers the statement that a woman's weapons are on her, which basically is a euphemistic way of saying, and another Gemara says, that in a case where you're dealing with people that are like people being attacked, a woman will be saved when men will be killed because because the bandits, the robbers, the non-Jews, whoever it is, want to save the woman in order to rape her. So therefore, it's more, we can understand why the woman would have escaped. Maybe she wasn't raped. Maybe she was being saved in order to be raped, and she managed to escape when the man was not. Okay, so there's two things going on there. Number one is what makes that less of a case of bidudami is that it's only the two of them. It's not a big chaotic situation, and what doesn't undermine and by the fact that she was saved doesn't undermine the statement that the man was killed, is because we can understand why she might have uniquely been saved other than him. Okay, so now the Gemara, it says like this. Just one second. Right. So Rashi says, Rashi and Hasam Kuravidi Baravin, Mashi says, Kolomar Hacha, Kivin di Muhammad Katanahi, Di Have Bahade, Lo Amr Bedidami. It's a little war, right? So it was something that was only the two of them. It was not as chaotic. So where we are right now is that we say that even if she didn't have to, it sounds like we're saying that even if we didn't know that there was war and she said it, the fact that she has no reason to lie doesn't change the fact that she might have drawn wrong conclusions. And the only time that we do believe her right now is the time where it was not a big chaotic situation, where it was just the two of them. Okay, so now the Gemara continues the following. Okay, Hahu Gavra. There's a certain man that at the end of his wedding, at the end of his nisuin, the chuppah, itli nura be ganani, a fire caught a fire broke out under his wedding chuppah, or on his wedding chuppah. Amarluhu devasayu. So his wife said to the people standing around, Chazu gavrai, look, my husband, he's on fire, come help. Also, people came, Chazu gavra charocha. By the time they got there, they found a charred person, a dead body that was charred, dishadi that was cast there, upisisa diyade, and a hand, a severed hand, dishadi that was cast there. So Summer of Chia Baravi Lememar, Hainu Ishinu Alenu Bayit Ishinu Alenu Mara. That's like the case that the house was filled with smoke, that she's not believed because okay, there was a fire, but who knows what happened? Now, obviously, there's a huge difference. What do you mean? Who knows what happened? There's a dead body there. So So Amar Rava says Rava Midami, who can compare it? Hasam lo kamra, chazuk avrai, chazuk avrai. First of all, in the case by the house filled with smoke, she's not saying, look at my husband, look my husband. So here she's calling people. So the fact that she's calling people, maybe also underscores the fact that she's seeing very concretely what's happening. It's not so clear why the calling people itself makes a difference, but again, we'll see later in the Gemara that maybe the more that other people can ascertain the facts makes her more careful to be communicating very concrete statements and facts and not any assumptions. So number one is she's calling people, but more significant is Va'od Gavacharocha Deshadi, pieces of the other Deshadia. There's a charred body there and a charred hand. So there's very concrete evidence that the husband died. You look at all the circumstances. So Rav Chia bar Avin, who did not want to assume the husband died, he would say, Gavacharocha Deshadya, Ema Inish Achrina Asalatzule, Va'achalise, Nura. So the charred body, maybe it's not the husband, maybe it's somebody else who wanted to try to save the husband, and the fire consumed him. And the hand that is charred, that is not part of the same body. So Deshadya, Nura Italia, maybe the husband's caught on fire. And this is the husband's hand, and the husband became disfigured. His hand burned, and this is his hand that fell off. And because he's ashamed that he now is disfigured, he's run away. And therefore, this is the husband's hand, and the husband has not actually died. And look, these situations about what conclusions you can draw, it's not just a question of what the woman is saying. So often cases of aguna, not because of a withholding of a get, because of questions about what happened to the husband, are cases where we have we know what happened, but we don't know, nobody saw the dead body. And what type of conclusions can you draw, right? So that's like an example here. Like we've got a dead body, we've got the fire, we've got that it was under the wedding canopy. This is no longer the case of Amra B'Dami, where she is saying, she's saying, it's my husband. Maybe it is, but even if you put that aside, we are looking at these facts. What conclusion can we reasonably draw from the facts? Okay, so there's both a question about what do we think do we think that she is saying based on concrete knowledge? And then there are also questions where even if we have all the facts, what types of conclusions are we able to draw? But we're beginning to see why it is that the rabbis might have been concerned under some circumstances that somebody say, no, I definitely saw him die. And but given the sort of chaotic nature, what does that mean? If you saw that there was a huge fire and he was in a room, and then you saw that there was a body laying there that was charred, would you go and report, I definitely saw him die? That's not a big jump. And from the person's perception, especially during all of the confusion, that totally might be how the person is perceiving, what types of dots a person is connecting there. Of course, the big question that runs through all of this is, why aren't we investigating more and probing more and asking her for concrete information, and let that then become the basis for drawing our conclusion based on how she answers our questions? And that's really not clear at all. So what we have is that the Gemara asked if the claim of war is coming from her, does that strengthen her statement? Hard to understand why, since we're afraid that she is drawing incorrect conclusions or making reasonable assumptions and interpreting facts, but it's not really supported by absolute concrete evidence. And if that's true, but she believes herself to be telling the truth, who cares if she's reporting that there was war and we didn't know it without her? Those are still legitimate concerns, and that seems to be where the Gemara ended up, that the fact that she's reported war doesn't help her. But then we have some situations where she is believed, either where it was not the chaos of war, it was just the two of them were attacked. And that's actually a bit of a surprise, because you could think there too, just because it's the two of them, she's running away. Who knows what assumption. So that's a surprise that she's believed there. And the other case is the issue we just dealt with, where there's actually some concrete evidence. She's calling people, you see a charred body, and so on. Okay, so now the Gemara continues. Ibailahu, they raise the following question. What about if it's not the woman, if it's one witness? Now, here again, the funny thing is, why would we believe an impartial person more than her if we're not afraid of lying? If it's just a question about Amr B'Didami, saying things based on how things look and are perceived. So somehow there's an assumption that when it's a third party, because he is maybe less emotionally involved in the situation, maybe because he's somehow less connected, has less of a vested interest. Either way it comes out, but also again is just able to be more objective, maybe because he's concerned that by presenting himself not as a direct party, but as a independent witness, then he's going to be more careful about his testimony. Right? He's not sort of saying like, "Oh my God, my husband and I were attacked, and this happened," and then you're actually a subject of the story that you're telling. Here, you're presenting yourself. I mean, you also might have been a subject. You were there in the battleground with the husband, but you're presenting yourself more as an outside witness, and therefore you'll be more careful. So somehow there's an assumption that if it's a third party, he's going to be, or she will be more careful. And then the question, therefore, is if a one witness says that the husband died in war, do we believe him? Okay, so let's take a look. Ibailhu. So they raised the question. Eight achad b'milchama mahu. One witness, guy comes back from the battlefield and says the husband died in war. What's the story? Time of date achad mehem. And the reason we believe one witness, because remember this goes back to what we learned in the earlier Ha'isha parak, and what we'll learn as we till the end of this Masechet about the believability of one witness to say that the husband died, which was the big chiddush of the rabbis, that normally you need two witnesses. So is the normal reason we believe one witness to say the husband died, that the facts will eventually come clear, lo meshaker, and he won't lie. Hachadam lo meshaker, here too he won't lie, because why would somebody lie about something that everybody's going to find out the truth sooner or later? Oh, Dilma, or do we say time of the reason that we believe one witness is because it's backed up by the fact that she's going to investigate herself and ascertain herself before she gets married, because of all the negative consequences that will occur if the husband actually isn't dead. The hacha lo daiko mitzvah. I'm going to take out the brackets. Here she won't. Why won't she? Because what the Gemara says before, the brackets are very confusing what's in there. It says sometimes she hates him, which has not been a concern of ours at all. So the without the brackets, or some replace the brackets with the word here on the side, lo daiko mitzvah da amra b'didami, because again, she will say based on drawing certain conclusions and based on perceptions and not based on facts. Rashi, even without those words in the Gemara, says that what's the Gemara means. So the degree that we need to rely on her, we've already established that in her case, again, presumably this has nothing to do with woman versus man, presumably even if the Eid Echad is a woman. But this has to do with the fact that if she's so directly involved in the circumstances and emotionally involved as well, she'll draw some incorrect conclusions. So if we need the Eid Echad to be backed up with her own ascertaining of the facts, then that's not sufficient in this case. And the way actually what Rashi also adds to that is maybe that's also why we won't believe him. Who cares if normally he'll be very careful and not say things that aren't true, because things will ultimately become to the surface and become known, and you'll be careful not to lie. Again, he doesn't think he's lying. The issue is not whether he might be lying. The issue is he drawing wrong conclusions? So the argument to believe to not believe him is clear. We're concerned that people will make mistakes, draw wrong conclusions. If it's true about the woman, it should be true about him. And anyway, if his testimony requires being backed up by what she's able to determine, or what we assume she's able to determine, we've already pointed out that that's a weak link. The argument to believe him is less obvious, but presumably that's based on the fact that he is a third party, more not directly involved in the issues, not as emotionally involved. He may not in general Amr B'Didami say things based on perception, not based on fact, and B, because he's presenting himself as a witness, it really has to do with his integrity, and therefore more than somebody who is like directly a party to the fact. Then the facts will eventually come to the surface. Avida legluye, he's going to be very careful, not just not to lie, but very careful to say things that are only very precise and very concrete knowledge. So that's the question of do we believe the Eid Echad? So let's take a look. I'm a Rami Bar Chama, said Rami Bar Chama, Tashma, come in here. I'm a Rabbi Akiva, said Rabbi Akiva, when I went to Naharda to make the leap year, which raises interesting questions. When are you allowed to make a leap year, add an extra month right outside of Eretz Yisrael? You're supposed to do it only in Eretz Yisrael. So that has to do with the fact that if there's nobody in Eretz Yisrael who's of the same level, you can do it outside Eretz Yisrael. Very important ideas that applied in the big debates, in the big power struggle after the in the time of the Gaonim, between whether the center was Bavel or Eretz Yisrael and who had the authority. There was a whole debate about about making a leap year, and in the end, Bavel won out because they said nobody is, there's nobody equivalent to the Gaonei Bavel in Eretz Yisrael. We are the seat of authority. So anyway, Rabbi Akiva said, when I went to Naharda in order to make the leap year, Matzati Nechemia Ish Beit Dali, I found this man, Nechemia Ish from the house of Beit Dali, Amrli, and he said to me, Shamati Shein Mesina to Isha B'Eretz Yisrael Al Pi Echad. I heard that in the land of Israel, they will not marry a woman based on one testimony. El Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba. The only one who will do it is Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba. So is that meaning just stam one witness saying a husband died, which is something that we've been taking for granted now for a long time? Or is that specifically the case of saying he died in war? Anyway, this is what he said, that there's only one person who will do that. Avinamti lo, and I said to him, that is correct. Amarli, he said to me, and more lahem, go back and tell them, Mishmi, in my name, Atem Yodim HaMedina Hazo Mishubeshet Begayasot. You know that this country, Naharda presumably, is is messed up, is somehow unstable due to army, due to the type of army troops that go through it. This is the tradition I have from Rabbi Gamliel the elder, that you can allow a woman to remarry on the basis of one testimony. Now, of one witness. Now, what is he saying? What does it have to do with the troops? And are we talking about a case of war? Not a case of war. He did mention troops. What is the issue about marrying off a woman? What are the circumstances of marrying off a woman based on Eid Echad? So let's see what the Gemara says. What does he mean to say that this country is, chaotic or unstable due to troops, army troops? Lav, does he not mean to say, even though this country is in a state of war and there are troops going, back and forth, nevertheless, that the point is that you believe one witness in a time of war, and that's why he mentions troops, and that's what's at stake. And he says that is actually his tradition. So you see that you do marry off a woman based on one witness at a time of war. So Alma and you see one witness is believed. Amar Rava, says Rava, no. Why is he saying this country, Naharda, we have this problem of troops? Why not just say, he was talking about what they did in Eretz Yisrael, what their position, halachic position was in Eretz Yisrael. So why not just say that when a country is in a state of war, and nevertheless you believe al pi echad? So Elam Rava, should have said whenever there are troops, you still believe based on Eid Echad. Elam Rava rather said Rava Harikama. This is what he means. Atem yodim shemedina zo mishbeshes begayasot v'lo efshar li lemishpach im shibeti umaisi kamei rabbanan. You know that it's very impossible. It's impossible to travel nowadays. There are all these troops, and we're in a state of war, and I can't get to Eretz Yisrael. But again, remember, the focus of the discussion was what is the psak in Eretz Yisrael. So he's saying, look, I can't go and tell them over there in Eretz Yisrael my tradition from Rabbi Gamliel the elder because of we're in a state of war. You go and you go back, and when you get back there, you tell them what the halacha is. But here's my tradition that you marry a woman based on Eid Echad, but it has nothing to do with in a time of war. That's just why he can't tell them himself. So we don't know from that story whether what was at stake was in general believing in Eid Echad, which we take very much as for granted, and then it would be a little bit shocking / surprising that in Eretz Yisrael, already by the time of Rabbi Akiva, towards the end of the period of the Tanaim, there's only one opinion that you could marry off a woman based on a single witness, that the husband had died. We've been assuming that is a completely universal assumption. So that's one version of it. The other version is that specifically was at stake was the issue of believing in aid at a time of war or about death during circumstances of war. So we don't know exactly how to interpret that. Toshma, come in here. So this is still our question, believing in Eid Echad in a situation of war. There were two Torah sages that were coming with Abba Yossi ben Simon a boat. The Tava, and the boat sank. The Hisi Rebbe Nishotehen Apinoshim, and Rebbe let their wives remarry based on the testimony of women. Some women saw the boat sink or survived on the life raft, and Rebbe said that based on the fact that they said the husbands were there and they sank, he allowed the wives. The wives weren't the ones reporting; other women were reporting. He allowed the wives to remarry. So now the Gemara says, water is like war, in the sense that people will generally say based on perception, not based on concrete, absolute concrete knowledge. Things are very chaotic and confusing, and people will draw assumptions. And these are not the woman herself, but a third party. And the Gemara says, and it's not a case of two witnesses, a formal two witnesses. How do you know that? Because v'noshim afilu meya keirechadami. So, statements in the Gemara that are like legal statements, but also a little bit jarring. 100 women is like one, but not like one man. Here it says like one witness, which means that no matter how many women witnesses you have, they never create the two formal male witnesses that are necessary in terms of that sense of formal testimony. So they always have the status of informal testimony, which is the same as one male witness. So here you have a case of informal testimony. The report of one person, or that does not count as formal testimony, and you are believing it. So this is exactly our case of Eid Echad b'milchama. One witness, meaning not two men formal witnesses, but one witness or women or whatever the case is, that are not the parties themselves, and they might be drawing wrong conclusions, but nevertheless, because they're not the parties themselves, you actually are not concerned about a misreporting, and you actually can take that testimony. So that seems to be good evidence. So let's see what the Gemara says. Viktani Hasi, that Rebbe married off their husbands, not the women, not those that are testifying. Married off the women of the people that were reported to be dead. So the Tispra says the Gemara, is that really true? Mayim shein lem sof ninu. This is water that has no end. Mayim shein lem sof ish tasura. We would never, even if there were two witnesses that said we saw a man drown in water without an end, you would not let the woman remarry. What does that mean, water without an end? It means that you cannot see all of the shores that surround the water. Why does that matter? If anything, you would see it's more likely that the guy had died. There's no shore for him to swim to. But no, the concern is that if you can't see the end of the water, then maybe he survived and he's somewhere in the water outside of your sight, right? And therefore, if it's such a vast body of water that you can't see the edges of it, any report that he drowned is never an absolute report. He might have gone under the water, and ultimately he would have survived. So the Gemara is saying, I don't get this case anyway. How did you allow for a remarry? Presumably, I don't know how the Gemara knew that this was a case of Ein Lahem Sof, but that was the assumption of the Gemara. So therefore, how could even with two formal witnesses, this story doesn't make sense. So the Gemara says, Ella Hechidami, what must be the case? The Amra Askinu Kaman, that they say, no, actually we saw the body. The body was brought in front of us. The Chazinuhu La'alter, and we saw him immediately. The immediately point is so that the water has not completely disfigured the body. The Kami Simanim, and they say that we actually saw some bodily marks. We saw a mole. We saw, he had some type of a weird birthmark, or he had a dislocated shoulder. Whatever they saw some things that were unique signs on the body. And therefore, that might be needed. Tosfos discusses, why do they need simanim? Why can't they say we recognize the face? So it could be once they were in the water for a little bit, the face is a little disfigured. It's not completely disfigured, but you need it to be reinforced by the presence of certain very identifying marks on the body. So therefore, in that case, we're not relying on them. We're relying on the very specific bodily marks that they identified. So basically, there's no concern there of Amri B'Didami, that people are saying based on perception. They saw actually the body, sort of like the case before about the charred body, but this is even better than the charred body, because the charred body, there was an assumption of whose body it was. Here there were actual simanim, and therefore we have very concrete evidence. So the Gemara has not really concluded whether or not you believe in Eid Echad. and that's obviously a huge issue, right? Is it that you only believe in Eid Echad in normal reports? Oh yeah, the guy passed away normally. Or do you believe in Eid Echad in cases where things are somewhat chaotic and war, fallen buildings? Just think about 9/11, are we willing to believe that even in that situation, or are we concerned that people draw wrong conclusions? Of course, the part that's missing from all of this is why are you so concerned that people are drawing wrong conclusions? Just ask very concrete questions and get to the bottom of it and figure out if you believe that they're telling the truth, then just clarify more what it actually means, what they are saying. So that obviously is a key part that is missing from this Gemara. Let's now take a look at another story, 2 lines from the top here on Kuf Tet Vav Amud Bet. Hu gava de ifkid shumshami. Now we're going to go from a very weighty case about people dying and drowning and burning to a dini mominous case about sesame seeds. Okay, and we will see an interesting analogy that the Gemara brings. Hu gavra de ifkid shumshami gabe chavre. A certain person gave as a for safekeeping a certain amount of sunflower seeds to his friend. Amrle havli shumshami, and after a while he said, "Give me back my sunflower seeds." Amrle shakaltinu, you already took them back a while ago. So the guy said back, "V'chein v'chein havyin." What do you mean? It was I gave you exactly 3 pounds of them, ubechavisa ramyan, and they were in that barrel, and they walked over, and there are 3 pounds of sesame seeds in that barrel. So Amarle, shakaltinu. No, you took yours back. These are other sunflower seeds. These are my sunflower seeds. So Savar of Chisda L'meimar. So Rav Chisda wanted to say, Hainu, this is like the case of the 2 sages that drowned, and the question was, were they the same people or not? And there he assumed that bracketing our discussion a minute ago about the simanim, he assumed that, they were on the boat, you found 2 bodies, you made certain assumptions that they looked the same, presumably they were the same people. So here too, it looks like the same amount, and you're going to assume it's the same sunflower seeds. Of course, the application from remarrying wives to issues of sunflower seeds, but when we apply different standards of proof, number 1, and number 2, also like how much, what's the concrete facts, how much circumstantial and context and evidence is there in one case versus how much in the other. So let's see what the Gemara does with it. So the Gemara says, that's like the case of the 2 Torah sages. We don't say, yeah, those 2 guys that were on the boat, they are drowned at the bottom of the sea, and these 2 bodies are other bodies. No, we assume 2 guys drowned, and we took out 2 bodies. It's the same 2 bodies. So Amalei Rava, so Rava said, Midami, how can you compare it? Hasam Kami Simanim. In that case, they gave identifying marks. Of course, that wasn't said explicitly in the case before. That's what the Gemara said. So Rav Chisda might not have been assuming that. Rav Chisda might have assumed 2 bodies, you match it up. But Rava said, no, we said that the case was only a case where they were identifying marks. Hacha Shum Shemi Mai Simani Islu. Here, there's no identifying marks. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? The Gemara came Havyan. And the fact that he said, it was exactly 3 pounds, and they found it was 3 pounds, isn't that an identifying mark? No. Emer Chushbani Isrami. Maybe it just so happened that it was the same amount, but 3 pounds and 3 pounds is not such an identifying mark. It's like saying that he was 5'4", and this guy is 5'4". You know what? A lot of guys that are 5'4", especially Jewish guys, there are a lot of times that you might have 3 pounds of sunflower seeds, and that's not enough of an identifying mark. Okay, so again, what's more interesting here is, rather than the Dine Mamonis case itself, is the pact about how much do you use certain circumstances. On the one hand, the whole problem of the woman is Amra B'Dami. On the other hand, as we saw about the charred body, and as we're sort of trying to figure out here how much identifying marks there were on the guys, what if we actually do know the facts? But it's not 100%. We do have to connect some dots and draw some conclusions. Are we ever able to Amra B'Dami, make some conclusions based on the facts and based on context? And then the question is, how many jumps can we make? Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Amalei Mar Kashisha bar Rav Chisda Rav Ashi. So Mar Kashisha bar Rav Chisda said to Rav Ashi, Shema Pinan. Are we really concerned, back to in the sunflower case, that maybe he took out the sunflowers from the barrel seeds and put in other sunflower seeds? Vatzanan, we turn to the Mishnah. Matzah Kli, if you found a vessel, the Kosav Alav, and written on it was Kuf, then you can assume that that means korban. That means that the stuff in it, whether it's money, whether it's grain, or whatever, was sanctified for hekdesh. Korban being symbolic of hekdesh, maybe specifically to be used as a korban or to give to hekdesh. Mem, if there's a mem on the vessel, maaser, it means that the grain in it is grain that is stored for maaser. Dalit, dimua. Dalit is a mixture that accidentally, when chulin and truma get mixed up together. Tet, tevel. Tet is a sign of a vessel containing grain that has not had trumas and meisus removed from it. Tuf, tachas truma. So I'm sorry, tuf truma, and tuf is for truma. Okay, so that's what you can assume is in this vessels. At the time of danger, they would write tough instead of truma because they would not be allowed to take trumas and maestros, or religious practices were forbidden. So therefore, they would just do it this way. Of course, even I don't know why you have to introduce shata sakana. Why do people have to write a whole word if one letter can't suffice? Anyway, the point being that you assume that the stuff that was stored in that vessel was the stuff that was originally put there, and not that the vessel was emptied and other stuff was put in its place. Now, of course, the point is, because if you have your vessels labeled, like what's the likelihood you're going to put salt in your sugar bowl? The reason for labeling them is so that you're consistent in terms of what you keep in them. So, but maybe it's a while since this vessel, maybe this vessel was found buried somewhere, and who knows, or, maybe you assume somebody reused it. Anyway, from this, the Gemara draws a conclusion that we're not assumed that things are emptied and reused. So here, how come by the sunflower seeds are we assume that the guy took the sunflower seeds out and somebody else, and he put his sunflower seeds in their place? So the Gemara says, Amalei Ravina Ravashi, are we not concerned that somebody might empty out a vessel and then reuse it for something else? Ema Sefer, look at the end. Rabbi Yossi Omer, afilu matzah chavis v'kasav aleha truma. Even if you found a whole barrel and explicitly was written on the barrel the word truma, hare elu chulin. You can say that what's in the barrel now is chulin. Shani Omer, ishtakar have truma, because I could say last year you used it for truma, upina, and you emptied it out and now you're using it for something else. So you see, it is quite possible that we assume that even something that was stored in a vessel is no longer the original thing. It must be that in general we are concerned that things might be emptied and then reused for something else. Here's the debate in terms of the truma situation. Mar Savar in Isa de Pineo Michber Have Kafir. One says if you were going to use the vessel for something else, you would have erased the letter that said tet for truma, right? You would not. You have something there that marks what it's about. So you're not going to. You might sure reuse a vessel, but you're not going to leave it with the wrong marker on it, which is a very reasonable concern. The Idacham, and the other one says you forgot that you had it labeled, and therefore you might use it for something else. Inami lipinchaya shavke, or maybe you intentionally kept stuff there with the marking of truma as a way of protecting it. You figured if it's not marked truma, people are going to eat it. But if it's marked truma, people won't touch it, and that's a way to protect it. So that's uniquely a concern by things that have an explicit label on them, that the label will indicate that you're consistent with the use. But things without the label, like the sunflower seeds and whatever, it's very reasonable that, maybe if the barrel was labeled Shimon sunflower seeds, that would be a similar circumstance. But since it wasn't a generic barrel, it's reasonable to assume that maybe he gave the guy his stuff back, and he then put, he gave Shimon his sunflower seeds back, and then he put his sunflower seeds in their place. Okay, so that was an interesting application, and again, interesting about whether we're going to have similar or different standards for dine mumminus as opposed to remarrying a woman based on testimony that the husband is dead. But again, questions about what types of circumstances and context lets us connect the dots. We're so concerned that she's connecting the dots and misreporting based on assumptions. Sometimes we have to be the ones connecting the dots anyway. Okay, so where are we right now? We are number one with the assumption that a woman is not believed because we're assuming she's drawing wrong conclusions, and it's just not limited to war. It applies to other things as well. We also though said that there are some cases where she is believed. Number one, if she says that he died under normal circumstances. B, maybe if she's the one reporting on the war, although we are concerned that she might be drawing wrong conclusions, somehow if she's reporting on the war, that'll make her more careful and more precise, not exactly clear why. So there seemed the inclination of the Gemara was not to believe her in those cases. On the other hand, if there's a third party, an Eid Echad, although he also might be drawing some conclusions, somehow the fact that he's a third party might make him more careful and more precise, and not say based on perceptions. And then there's the issue about whether we ourselves, under what circumstances will we draw the right conclusions. Okay, so now the Gemara continues. 2 dots, about 15 lines from the bottom. Yitzchak, Reish Galusa, Bar Achase de Rav Bibi. So Yitzchak, the Reish Galusa, he was actually the political head of the Jews in Bavel, and he was the son of the sister of Rav Bibi. Okay. He was going from Cortava, I don't know what that is, maybe it's Cordova, but to Aspamia, to Spain. Vishachi, right? So here he is. He's not just in Bavel, like, he's responsible for the whole diaspora. So he was on a trip, maybe a type of a political tour. Anyway, he was taking this trip and he died. So they sent the following message. Yitzchak, Reish Galusa, Yitzchak, the head of the exile, Bar Chassid Rav Bibi, the son of the sister of Rav Bibi, was traveling from Cordova to Aspamia, to Spain, and he died. So that's very precise information. It's not a case of milchama. It's certainly milsa davida ligluye. What type of a concern can there be? So let's take a look. Mi chayshin and letrei Yitzchak olo. Are we concerned that there might be 2 people with the same name, 2 Yitzchaks? Now, this, of course, seems so absurd. How many Yitzchaks are there that are the Reish Galusa, the son of the sister of Rav Bibi? So it seems like a very bizarre concern, because there are all of these very clearly identifying information. Anyway, let's see where the Gemara goes with it. But let's sort of not worry ourselves right now about why it's relevant exactly to this. But let's just ask in general the question. We get a message. Shimon, the son of Ruvain from this town, died. Do we have to be concerned that there might be somebody else with that name? This is a place where you didn't have social security numbers. You didn't have family names, How much identifying information do you need to know who we're talking about? Again, in this case, it seems like there was plenty of identifying information. But let's see what the Gemara says. Abaye Amar Cheshinan, we are concerned that somebody else might have the same name. Rav Amar Lo Cheshinan, we're not concerned. Amar Abaye, says Abaye. Mina Minallah. Where do I know this? That we don't assume that just because we know a guy by that name, that it's necessarily the same guy. The Hu Gita, Tishtakach b'Naharda. There was a get found in Naharda. The Kosiv, and it was written in the get, B'tzad Klonia Masa, by the in the environs of the city of Klonia, Anna Andrulinai, I Andrulinai, Naharda of Naharda, Pataris Vitarichi says Plonis Intiti. I have divorced and sent away so-and-so, my wife. Okay, that was the language of the get. V'shilcha, and I have sent her away. I've sent away my wife. V'shilcha avua de Shmuel, v'shalcha avua de Shmuel, l'kamei de Rav Yehuda Nisiya. And the father of Shmuel sent this get to the presence of Yehuda Nisiya, the grandson of Rav Yehuda Nasi. I wanted to know, can I assume that this guy is the person we know from Naharda of the same name? And he sent back to him, Tivdok Naharda Kula. You have to, check the entire Naharda to find out if there's somebody else that has the same name. We know, now Rashi even points out that it said, I, Andrulilai, the husband of Sarah from Naharda, divorced my wife. And we know a guy in Naharda called Andrilinai, whose wife's name is Sarah. Like, we know somebody who matches the entire description. Can we just assume it's the guy we know? Or do we have to be concerned? Maybe there's another guy in Naharda with the same name whose wife has the same name. So that was the question. And the answer of Rabbi Yehuda Nisiya was, yes, you have to investigate the entire Naharda. Like, Naharda is not just a city, right? It's a whole region. Well, maybe it's a city, but anyway, it's a little bit larger. Anyway, then, and you have to investigate the entire Naharda and to find out that there's nobody else that has exactly those characteristics, that has that name and whose wife has that name. So you see, we are concerned. We don't just assume it's the person we think it's talking about. Okay, Rava says, "Im Isa yivda kol alami bayale." No, that can't be. If we really could not draw logical conclusions, then you would have to check the entire world. Why would you have to check the entire world? It says from the Naharda, because he says Nardal. Maybe Nardal just means that that's where he was when he was writing the get. Ella. I think Rashi says that. Yeah, Shema Andrilai Acher Haya ben Nardava Halachlo. Right? Maybe he's not even, or maybe there was a guy living here, and he no longer lives here. Maybe he was living here when the get was written. So when would there ever be an end to that if you had to be concerned with those things? Ella, says Rava, rather, Mishum Kvoda Davua de Shmuel Hu de Shalachachi. The reason he said, yes, you should check it out, it was to, because to show respect to the father of Shmuel. The father of Shmuel raised this question, and rather than saying it's a stupid question, of course it's the guy you know, he said, you know what, you better check it out. Okay, gave Avodah de Shmuel a lot of work to do, but he said that rather than just saying, you don't have to worry about it, which is pretty funny. Since when do we sort of do that? And let's say it takes a long time, and the wife isn't able to remarry during that time. So it seems to going a pretty far way to say to give an answer that is not really necessary, just not to sort of be concerned about being dismissive of the question. But anyway, that's what Rabbi says. So Rabbi says once it seems to the guy, once you have somebody that fits those specifics, you don't have to be concerned that there was somebody else who also fits the exact same specifics. Okay, Amar Rava, says Rava, where do I know this point that you don't have to be concerned there's somebody else that fits those specifics? The Hanu Trei Shari Dinafik b'Mechuza. There are two documents that came from Mechuza. The Kosevahu Bar Nigoi Vininoi Bar Chavi, and it was written in them that there were two that two people's names were written on them. One guy's name was Bar Nigai, and the other was Nigai Bar Chavi. So apparently, or Chavi Bar Nigai, and the other was Nigai Bar Chavi. Almost have like a mirror image names. Okay, and these were like IOUs. These were writs written from a creditor to a debtor, or from a debtor to a creditor. Okay, V'agvi b'hu Rava Bar Avua Zuze, and Rava Bar Avua found that they were allowed somebody to collect with them, even though maybe somebody else had a similar name. Chavi Bar Ningai V'Ninoi Bar Chavi b'Mechuza Shchichi Tuva, and he says these are very common names, right? So it was like Shimon ben Ruvain and Yaakov ben Levi, right? And these were the names. I mean, you could tell that they were common names because both the creditor and the debtor had similar names. And nevertheless, he basically said that that the guy holding the document can assume to be the creditor, and it's not exactly clear how you know which guy was the debtor if there were other people that had similar names, but somehow based on the context of who was in the same city or whatever type of things, you could assume that they're the people we assume them to be, and you don't have to be concerned that there might be somebody else, even when there really are other people that might have similar names. And this is actually, almost the exact opposite of the case of of the Reish Galusa. So here, even when it's reasonable there are other names, we do not have to be concerned about that. We can use the context to make us assume who it is referring to. So that's his proof. So if Abaye, and Abaye would say back, Lemay Nechoshla. No. What do we have to be concerned? What do we have to be concerned about? Ilanafila means Zayir. If you're concerned that maybe he dropped it, creditors don't drop their IOUs. So we're not concerned that another guy, the creditor dropped it and another guy with the same name found it. If maybe we're afraid that he gave it to somebody else for safekeeping who had the same name, and the creditor gave it to somebody else, and this guy is misusing it to collect for himself. Even the nobody is stupid enough, creditor, to give this IOU to another person who has exactly his same name, and then he can go ahead and use it to collect. So he wouldn't have given it, so he wouldn't have dropped it. He wouldn't have given it to somebody else with the same name. So who else would it be that's holding on to it except the guy whose name it's written in? Maya Marta, Dilma Masterle, maybe he gave it to somebody. Maybe he transferred the IOU to somebody else, and he transferred it, but he did not ultimately, finish the acquisition. So this other guy is holding on to it, but he hasn't actually acquired the debt. So no, osios niknas b'mesira, the very act of handing it over, would have transferred the debt. So basically, we're not afraid that somebody else other than the creditor is holding on to it. The creditor would not have dropped it accidentally. He wouldn't have intentionally given it to some person for safekeeping. And if he intended to sell it to this person, and we don't have to be concerned that the sale wasn't finalized, because the very act of giving is the finalization of the sale. Of course, the funny thing is that it might very well be that this person is the one that is what do you call it? That is the right creditor, but how do we know the debtor is the right debtor? Also, the question to be asked is, what are they saying? I mean, obviously the creditor is saying it's him, but what's the debtor saying? I mean, if the debtor isn't challenging that this guy is the creditor and the debtor isn't challenging that he's the debtor, what else would we be concerned about? And if the debtor, so was it the case that the debtor was challenging that this was the guy? I mean, if the debtor was denying that he was the debtor, right? What allows us to assume that this is the debtor? There's no good, it doesn't seem that that's clear. So you have to sort of try to speculate what exactly the case here was. The case that would make the most sense is that the debtor was admitting that he was the debtor, but challenging that this guy was the creditor. And that's why the Gemara Rabbi is able to say, no, then the circumstances are good enough evidence of what's what. But anyway, we have from one extreme of questioning, even with a lot of identifying marks, Yitzchak, Reish, Galusa, the son of the sister, et cetera, that maybe we have to question whether it's the person that fits those criteria. And then we have a middle case of, again, somebody who has pretty good identifying marks, his name, his wife's name, his town's name, not as much as the Reish Galusa case. And now we have a case where seems to be actually lacking in a good degree of identification, and it seems that Abai and Rava disagree on the whole range of cases. The last case, we must admit, if it's a little question about who the debtor is, it is very hard to understand Rava's position. What is the evidence that you're dealing with the right debtor? But anyway, it is interesting. It seems to be a wide range of cases, whether we can make assumptions. Now, this is before we end, we should point out that this is relevant two ways. Number one, it's relevant just because we want to know about remarrying, allowing a woman to remarry. So when there are reports and about coming from a distance and giving people's names, can we assume that those names are the persons we're referring to? But it is also worth pointing out the parallel of this to the idea of Amra B'Didami and drawing and connecting the dots based on context. Because if we're concerned that there was a house that was filled with smoke and there were arrows being shot, and maybe she thought the guy was dead and he wasn't really dead, and the whole concern is drawing, conclusions. Well, we've already dealt with a few cases of drawing conclusions. Maybe drawing conclusions with a charred body, maybe drawing conclusions with, with the bodies that were lifted up, but okay, that was maybe a little bit more reasonable, drawing conclusions about what's in the barrel types of cases. But more significantly here is drawing conclusions based on whose name it is. We get a report of a certain name and we're going to connect some dots and make some assumptions. So there very often are cases where we connect the dots and make assumptions based on context about what exactly happened or who's exactly being referred to. And that really remains the point. It's one thing to say the woman was incorrectly drawing those conclusions, but very often those are, we're not going to have all the facts and we're going to have to sort of connect some of the dots ourselves. And one issue of connecting the dots is not, is this the same body that we lifted up out of the ocean, or did the person really die, or is this the same body that got charred and burned? But when we have a report about a specific name, do we know who this name is referring to? Okay, so we will continue with this discussion when we resume tomorrow, hopefully in person.